Sam Mickey. Welcome back to the Yale Forum on Religion and Ecology podcast, Spotlights. So this week I wanted to put the spotlight on Bruno Latour. And of course, Latour is a great French philosopher and anthropologist, social scientist who passed away a couple of years ago. And we did a in memoriam episode about him on the podcast a while back. And he's had some posthumous publications come out in the meanwhile. And I want to talk about the most recent one. It came out in English translation in April 2024. The French had come out just after his death in 2022. And the book is called If We Lose the Earth, We Lose Our Souls. So just wanted to give a brief overview and review of what this book is about and really encourage people to check it out, especially if you're interested in the intersection of Christianity and ecology or Christianity and cosmology. And I think it's a good intro to his later work. So, for a brief background, Latour is one of the most widely read French philosophers in the world, partly because of the wide range of his thinking and covering things like sociology, anthropology, science studies, science and technology studies, philosophy. And then toward the later years of his work, he became increasingly engaged with issues of ecology and Earth system science. He got very interested in Gaia theory, wrote a book called Facing Gaia, and he's very interested in the shift in cosmology that's been happening in the last century, moving away from a mechanistic universe toward an evolutionary universe that's full of self-organizing dynamics. So I think this book is a good intro to that side of his thought, this kind of ecological turn that he had, and especially insofar as ecology intersects with religion. Specifically the religion of Christianity, and even more specifically with Catholicism. And Latour himself was Catholic, and you don't necessarily get much of a sense of that in his very early work. But again, toward the end of his life, the last maybe 10, 15 years, he was more engaged with questions of religion and what to do with Catholicism. So it's a very short book. It comes in around 80 pages. And there's a brief foreword, and then there's 4 chapters. So very short, very accessible. And some of Latour's work can be a little obtuse in the way that a lot of post-1945 French philosophy can be, or in the way that a lot of philosophy in general can be. That's kind of a stereotype of philosophy that's hard to read, hard to access. But this is a very conversational book. Part of it is because there's some conference presentation kind of material. There's interview material. So really easy to access. So I highly recommend it along those lines. And overall, I think the main theme is that there's a negative and a positive challenge to Christians. The negative one is, he says, pay attention to the earth at a time when it's been neglected. And that means overcome the tendency for Christianity to not be interested in earthly things as opposed to heavenly things, right? So modern theology overall should be open to taking more interest in cosmology, not just the earth, but cosmology. Another crucial point, because a lot of work done in the field of religion ecology still stays at the scale of ecosystems or the planet and often misses the larger cosmic context of this, but that's crucial. So the positive challenge, he's asking Christians to renew their apostolic teaching, their understanding of their faith in the context of the new image of the world that's emerged, not just from cosmology, but from Earth system science, which he, of course, likes to think of as Gaia theory. And for a variety of reasons, a lot of scientists don't like talking about Gaia. They'll talk about Earth systems, but he's very committed to Gaia. So I'll say just a little bit about each of the chapters. This will be just a short episode and just a little bit of an invitation to let people know that the book came out and that it's worth reading, that it's probably Latour's most explicit engagement with the religious dimensions of his work. The first chapter is called The Great Clamor, and it's a conversation with the Jesuit priest and journalist Antonio Spadaro, and lovely interview. And again, very short. All these chapters are very short, easy to get through. And the big thing here is he's comparing the 2015 encyclical by Pope Francis, Laudato Si, with his own book, Facing Gaia, because those both came out in the same year, 2015. And he's kind of lamenting the fact that his book came out around the same time because He really wishes it would have come out a little after Laudato Si, so he could have integrated Laudato Si into the book because he sees a lot of parallels. And the main thing is there's a changing perception of the world and nature, right? And how do we integrate that into our lives? And so, he does that with facing Gaia. He's saying, look, we have this new understanding of the earth as something like a living organism, right? Gaia. It's a complex, dynamic, self-organizing system. It's not just an object, right? In terms of like Thomas Berry, right? It's not a collection of objects, it's a communion of subjects. And so he does that kind of work in Facing Gaia, and he's saying Laudato Si is basically doing the same thing, that the prophetic and eschatological dimension of the new cosmological situation has been really expanded explicitly in Laudato Si. And in particular, like a lot of people point out when they talk about Laudato Si, it's this integration, this conjoining of the cry of the earth and the cry of the poor, which means we're bringing back cosmology and ecology into morality and theology. And and I should say he also doesn't mention that the cry of the earth and the cry of the poor is a phrase that comes from the Brazilian liberation theologian Leonardo Boff. Anybody that knows me knows I kind of complain about that all the time because it's kind of just public facing. It's this phrase. If you just Google cry of the earth, cry of the poor, you'll find that there's a book by Leonardo Boff with that title. But I think a lot of people miss that because Pope Francis doesn't cite that in Laudato Si. He mentions cry of the earth, cry of the poor, doesn't cite it for complicated political reasons, because of the kind of left-leaning politics of liberation theology and of Boff's work in particular. So he says it but doesn't cite it, and so then that's confused almost everybody who's written and spoken about Laudato Si. They often miss this connection with liberation theology, Latin American liberation movements, which I think is crucial. And we should keep in mind that Pope Francis is the first Latin American pope, first American pope in general, but Latin America in particular. So, that'd be my little critical remark. But of course, you can't say everything all the time, but he does appreciate the conjoining of the cry of the earth and the cry of the poor. And one of the great questions that the interviewer asks is why aren't Catholics getting on board with this? I mean, some Catholics are, to be sure, but not all of them. There's about 1 billion Catholics on the planet, and they're not all getting really riled up about this. Cry of the earth, cry of the poor, let's do something. And Latour's answer is because a lot of people still haven't learned that there's been a second scientific revolution. We think of the first scientific revolution around the time of people like Rene Descartes, Francis Bacon, Isaac Newton, and he's like, something new has happened in the 20th century with understandings of evolutionary cosmology, earth system sciences, ecology, and word hasn't gotten out yet. So people don't understand why Pope Francis is talking like this. They're like, Earth, it's just this thing we live on. It's just some resources. Why is he all about the cry of the earth? Earth can't cry, it's just stuff. And according to the second scientific revolution, it's not just stuff. It is capable of being moved, right? In the sense of having a cry, having an expressive side of it. And the interviewer also asks about the kind of affective dimension of this. And Latour's like, right, exactly. It's like we're trying to learn new capacities for listening to the cry of the earth, the cry of the poor. And that means new capacities for moving about in the world. And one of the problems is that when people think about developing capacities for moving about in the world, they say, oh, right, like spiritual exercises. And Latour's saying, yes, but some of these exercises people don't perceive as spiritual. The idea that we're supposed to engage with ecology as a spiritual exercise, people know, but ecology is not spiritual, that's just science. But again, one of the things that's happened with the second scientific revolution is the old division between science and religion has kind of fallen away. And both science and religion can offer really valid perspectives on who we are as humans, what we're doing on Earth, what the universe is. So that's part of the difficulty. So these exercises aren't always perceived as spiritual. People still think ecology is not spiritual. So it's hard to get the word out about that. So that's a theme throughout the whole book. How to transmit what Pope Francis has been saying to the broader Catholic community and to Christians more generally. Also, a nice question about lockdown. Latour had written a book about lockdown in the last couple years of his life, reflecting on the lockdowns due to the COVID-19 pandemic. And Latour's main point is, as we're emerging from the confinement, the kind of health-based confinement of the COVID lockdowns, we're entering into a new planetary confinement. But confinement not in a bad sense, but like we're coming down to Earth. We're recognizing that we do live here, that there's no way out, right? There's no planet B. And despite some people's aspiration to live on Mars, that's not happening anytime soon. And so for the meantime, this is where we live. So in terms of our space and our time, we live here, we live now. And that's also a theme throughout the book, is this integration of space and time, which again is a kind of 20th century scientific discovery, the space-time continuum, that we're here and we're now, the now is here, the here is now. So again, a main theme through the book. And if you're interested in that more, check out his book on lockdown. And the last question in this interview is also really helpful for understanding the overall trajectory of Latour's work, which is, what are the lessons that you've picked up from 50 years of research? And the main lesson from Latour is that we're on the verge of something that we still haven't achieved. No one's ever really grasped, in a non-hegemonic way, the plurality of modes of truth. Science, politics, religion, art, etc. And in a non-hegemonic way, right? Sometimes people integrate all of those, but they integrate them where one formula is in charge of all the others. One mode of truth is in charge of all the others. And he's like, we still have yet to really integrate this plurality as a plurality, to see how science, politics, religion, art, and different ways of living can all have their own validity while also being in dialogue with one another. So that's an ongoing challenge of his work. And that really is throughout every single book that Latour has done. It's trying to see, things like science, politics, art, science, art, religion. So that's the challenge for Latour, integrating multiple perspectives, multiple modes of truth, and seeing each mode of truth as having its own validity, not seeing like science as the ultimate arbiter, and then art is just kind of decoration on top of science. Like, no, each mode has its own truth. And of course, there's a whole project he had on this called An Inquiry into Modes of Existence, where he tried to sort out all the different modalities of truth. So that's another book you can get into if you want to explore that. So a lot of the same themes come up throughout the rest of the book. The second chapter is called Ecological Mutation and Christian Cosmology. And this is a conference paper that he presented at the International Congress of the European Society for Catholic Theology in Osnabrück, Germany, back in August 2021. And here, as the title reflects, there's two crises he's talking about. Ecology, there's a new mutation, a new understanding of what Earth is about. And then Christian cosmology, how to transmit this to Christians, to Catholics in particular. So three things here, I guess. There's the contrast he develops between cosmological projection and preaching. And then, and by projection, he doesn't mean like a psychoanalytic projection thing. He just means amplifying the message of salvation history. And then the preaching is the conversion element to that, right? Because it's one thing to tell somebody, hey, there's a new cosmology, and they understand that as information, as common sense. But there's another thing where you have this conversion to it, this kind of existential transformation. And a lot of times that conversion is often a break with common sense. And he uses the example of the Good Samaritan in that case, right? The Good Samaritan broke with common sense by helping the wounded Jew in that story. And so he's saying that one of the people who's helped bridge the gap between the projection, the amplifying the message, and the preaching, the conversion, is exactly Pope Francis in Laudato Si. So another great example that Latour's appreciation for Pope Francis is very much on full display in this text. And there's a lot of critiques also of anthropocentrism that comes up in this chapter and in other chapters, and that it's really not just about science or religion. It's really whether you're anthropocentric or non-anthropocentric. And he's saying that the new sciences coming out of ecology and earth system sciences are really encouraging non-anthropocentrism, and the new message coming out of people like Pope Francis, likewise encouraging a non-anthropocentric relationship so that we're able to integrate our concerns for the poor, for humans, and our concerns for our Earth community. Um, so lots of good examples in here, in terms of getting specific, mentioning the Garden of Eden, mentioning salvation history, redemption, the incarnation, the Good Samaritan, which I just mentioned, and a lot of talk also of eschatology and apocalypse, and mentions various theologians as well, which I've already heard some people comment on the book saying it's really nice to see that Latour was increasingly engaging with theologians. Because sometimes people write about religion without reading the work that other theologians have written on it. And you can tell in this text that Latour is engaging them, including Pierre Teilhard de Chardin. And of course, Teilhard is widely influential in eco-theology, evolutionary theology. And Latour kind of laments the fact that Teilhard had to try to fit with the theology of his time, like early to mid 20th century theology. And so he was kind of constrained by that. If Teilhard was around now, he'd be much more accepted and celebrated. And of course, Pope Francis has spoken on this as well, talking about his appreciation for Teilhard. Of course, Teilhard was a Jesuit. Pope Francis is a Jesuit. So on to chapter 3. I don't need to give an exhaustive summary. That kind of gives away the whole book. It should be like a teaser for the book more than a thorough review. Let's see. The third chapter is called On a Decisive Overturning of the Schema of the End Times. So again, talking about eschatology, apocalypse, trying to really think differently about apocalypse. We're not trying to announce the apocalypse. We're trying to avoid an end time. And lots of people have written about this. Like, we don't want the kind of terrible cataclysmic violence that you think about when you think about the book of Revelation, right? The book of Apocalypse. But we do need to bring about an end to our destructive presence on the planet. So we're not trying to announce terrible destruction and the end of the earth. We're trying to end our terrible destruction and renew the face of the earth. Interesting thing about this chapter, too, is he's drawing a lot on German painter Neo Rauch, who did this painting of Pope Francis as a saint, Saint Francis of Bergoglio, right? Of course, Pope Francis takes his name of Saint Francis of Assisi, but so this painting is called Saint Francis of Bergoglio, Martyr, Receiving Homage from Gaia. And the interesting thing is, Rauch won't release the painting. He wouldn't let Latour reproduce it in the book. It's kind of like too controversial, because Pope Francis isn't a saint, and maybe one day, but not now. And so it's an interesting thing because you see Latour interpreting this painting without any visual representation of it. So very interesting. And again, it comes down to the cry of the earth and the cry of the poor. And Latour also mentions his fellow French philosopher Michel Serres, who had talked about this ability for the earth to be expressive, to be moved, right? Moved in an emotional sense. Like that's very moving. And so instead of the idea that the earth moves, like the earth moves around the sun, the earth rotates on its axis, it's also the case that the earth is moved. Also a lot of talk in this chapter on immanence and imminence, right? Imminent time-wise and immanence, which is normally immanence as opposed to transcendence. Latour is saying, don't think of immanence as the opposite of transcendence. Think of immanence as the continuity between the transcendent and the here and now. And so the immanence is kind of how the transcendent is immanent, like it's showing up right now. So the civic and the cosmic are connected, and that we need rituals to perform this. And of course, lots of work being done with ritual studies and its intersection with ecology. In all religions, rituals are changing to adapt to our new situation. And Latour specifically calls for rituals that rebuild the commons, right? This kind of shared non-proprietarian relationship to Earth. Common pool resources, as they're sometimes called. And of course, the great economic theorist Elinor Ostrom won a Nobel Prize in economics for demonstrating that the commons is possible. There's that old idea that the commons always ends up in tragedy because somebody overuses it. And Latour is saying, if we have rituals that build trust and reciprocity in our community, that we can restore the commons. We can learn to share the earth again with one another and with all the other non-human inhabitants and habitats on the planet. So again, not trying to get too much into it. It's a short book. I don't want to just read the whole thing to you. But he's talking again about apocalypse, and it's about just slowing down, learning to prevent the end of life on Earth, to prevent that kind of apocalypse. And so again, there's so much work that's been done on like eco-apocalyptic stuff. So this is making a nice contribution to it, trying to seize the imminence of the incarnation and struggle against the attempt to escape from Earth, to leave earthly things behind. And then chapter 4 is the titular chapter. If you lose the earth, what good will it do to have saved your soul? Right? If we lose the earths, will we say lose our souls? And it's the whole thing like, is it okay to lose the earth because Jesus is going to return and we all get to go to heaven? And that's kind of the attitude, some Christians, maybe we could say a lot of Christians, that's an equivocation. A lot could mean any number, but it's common. I know I've definitely with Christians I've met throughout my life, there's been people I've known who's like, this doesn't matter. The ecological crisis doesn't matter because Jesus is coming back. And he's like, well, that's anthropocentric. And the idea that when Jesus returns, that he'd be okay with so much terrestrial destruction, like, no, of course not. So then, for Latour, he's trying to resituate a lot of the debate between religion and ecology. He's like, the question isn't, are you religious or scientific? The question is, are you anthropocentric or not? Anthropocentric or non-anthropocentric? And so that's really what he's asking for. He's asking for people to leave behind their anthropocentrism, which of course has been a dominant theme in the whole history of environmental ethics since it was coined, in the early 70s by people like Richard Routley, saying we need a new ethic, an environmental ethic, and it needs to be non-anthropocentric. So that's still the struggle today. Another thing in this final chapter is Latour reiterates something that he's been doing, since the early 2000s, of saying that, ecology and earth system sciences asks us to do away with the concept of nature as opposed to culture, that old binary between nature and culture, where nature is basically objects, culture is subjects. And but the interesting thing here is he's not saying ecology without nature, which is something he was saying in the early 2000s. So many other people, also Slavoj Žižek, of course, Timothy Morton's book, Ecology Without Nature, famously made that point. The interesting thing here is he's saying creation is different than nature. Of course, the creation care movement has made this kind of point too. Like, we don't need to talk about nature. There's maybe no such thing as nature as it's normally conceived, as opposed to culture. But there's creation. And so instead of protecting nature, we need to facilitate the ongoingness of creation. So more like creation instead of nature. And we need to be creative participants in God's creativity, and to recognize the agency of creation. And so for Latour, this is what incarnation is all about. And if you want to celebrate incarnation, you celebrate it by getting free of the idea of a causational God, where God is the cause and nature is the effect, and get more into this idea of ongoing participation in God's creativity. And he brings up Teilhard. He says Teilhard would have excelled at this exercise, but he was very much trapped in the obligation to prove himself to the orthodoxy of his time. One other thing in this chapter that I wasn't too excited about is he brings up degrowth and thinks of it as a kind of humiliation, like stop growing, get smaller, and that kind of thing. And it is part of the term degrowth makes people think that. And you can check out, there's another episode we've done on the podcast about degrowth with Chad Barron, who's a co-founder of a nonprofit called Degrowth California. And we talked about it there. Degrowth is not austerity. It sounds like it is. It sounds like it's saying stop growing and get smaller, but it's really saying share more, restore the commons. And it's really about stopping a certain type of growth. Growth focused on gross domestic product, like GDP growth, growth of profit. And we do want to grow other things. We want to get big in certain respects. It's not about not touching the earth, it's about touching it in ways that are very regenerative. And so, interesting kind of misunderstanding. And I hear this a lot in people's criticisms of degrowth. It sounds like it's telling us to shrink. And really, what is shrinking us is our currently destructive economic system that's causing us to live more constrained lives, less happy. There's a lot more profit around the world, but a lot less happiness. The rich are getting richer. The cry of the poor is getting louder. So degrowth is very much aligned with Pope Francis's vision. People have actually written about that before, so you can look up and find essays on Pope Francis and degrowth. So I felt like Latour was a little off on that one, but his overall point is correct, which is that we don't need to stop growing. We want to grow families. We want to grow gardens. We want to have schools, hospitals, churches. We want to grow, but that growth should be oriented toward the benefit of the earth and the poor, not toward the benefit of the wealthy. So, it's a common misunderstanding. Interesting also because the degrowth movement started in France. And so it's interesting that Latour, as a French philosopher, had that misunderstanding. But that literature has really expanded a lot in recent years, and he probably just wasn't fully up on it. And then more discussion of creation without nature, ecology without nature, some references to Frankenstein, which is always the point, and Latour has written about this before, that the problem with Frankenstein, right, wasn't that he created the monster, like the hubris of Frankenstein to create such a thing, to think he can create life. The real problem with Frankenstein was he abandoned the monster. He abandoned his creation instead of learning to love it and take care of it. So we need to love our monsters. We need to pay attention to the things we create, tend to them, love them, make sure they don't run amok. And this chapter also concludes with a nice point that there's kind of a paradox of our time, that some people are saying we have to have revolution, and then other people say it's impossible to have revolution. And there's some people who are saying, look, the end time is near. Revolution, right? Let's change. Let's repent, for the end is at hand. Let's try to bring about the kingdom of heaven, which is at hand. And then there's people who say there's no more revolutionary spirit. All we can do is resign ourselves and just do like planetary hospice work. And so it's interesting that both of those things are said because they're contradictory. Can we make a change? Can we not make a change? And so both of those voices are very loud right now. And of course, he's saying, I think we can make a change, that it's not too late. And so I'll just leave us with a few quotes that come just throughout the book, just to give you a sense of his own voice in this text. So here's one. To prevent the end of time, to plunge into the realities here below, to immerse ourselves instead of emancipating ourselves, to learn to depend. Such is the rediscovered movement and energy of apostolic preaching. Here's another that's really more about the anthropocentrism problem. The quarrel between science and religion scarcely hides another much deeper quarrel between those who speak above all of the cosmos, sciences and the religions, and those who speak only of humans and their interests. Dare I say that the real quarrel is located from now on between the cosmocentrists, scientists and religionists alike, and the anthropocentrists, not to say the humanists. So let me risk going even further. Can we still say that a humanist morality exists now that ecological eschatology has come knocking at the door? So again, calling for a cosmocentric morality. And then one more. We have acknowledged, learned, understood the extraordinary power of scientific truth, the extraordinary necessity of political truth, the formidable power of fiction, and now, with ecology, the formidable, essential, and substantial existence of the beings involved in reproduction. A possibility that was closed off before is now opening up, that of instituting religious truth as well, without asking of it more than it can give, but without taking away from it anything it has to offer. So again, highly recommend this book. If you love Latour, hate him, never heard about him, I think this is a fun foray into his thought, and it gives a lot of food for thought, and it connects a lot with other people doing eco-theology and religion and ecology work. And especially if you're interested in Pope Francis and the implications of Laudato Si, I think this makes a really helpful contribution. And I'll be curious to see what other posthumous works are coming out from Latour, because he was so prolific, and so many interviews that might still be translated, conference papers might be translated, maybe journals, notes. We'll see. But it's definitely another good contribution to his work and to the field of religion ecology. So I hope you enjoy it, and hope you enjoyed this short little episode. We'll be back with another episode for you soon in a couple weeks. So in the meantime, as always, take care and be well.